Welcome to Coffee, Crochet, and Unsolved Murder. I'm your host, Stacy, and this is the place where we drink our coffee, work on our crochet projects, and talk about unsolved murder. Today's episode is episode 4, the case of the locked room murder. So grab your coffee, grab your crochet hook, and let's start talking about today's unsolved murder case. And it is the case of J.B. Joseph Bound Elwell, or J.B. Elwell. And I'm going to go by J.B. or Mr. Elwell during this episode because I don't know how to say his middle name. And yeah, I feel bad getting it wrong. So we're going to call him J.B. or Mr. Elwell. I'm going with cold coffee again today. And of course, I'm going with my Black Rifle Coffee Company. And we are drinking rich mocha today. And no, I am not sponsored by Black Rifle Coffee Company, but I am open to it if any of you guys hear me. I am a military mom, and I believe in following and helping out our military. So, Black Rifle Coffee Company is a military-owned, a veteran-owned company. And I gladly drink their product because A, it's really good, and B, it's just really good. But I am not sponsored by them, but I just really like their product. Let's get into it, shall we? Episode 4, The Locked Room Murder. At a young age, J.B. Elwell was going places. At 14, he was an insurance agent. How that happened, I don't know. But he was. That's a known fact. And then when the game of bridge came out, he became obsessed with learning this game. So he did. Became very very good at it. And literally became a master at bridge. He started a men's group in his church where they would meet and play bridge. He would also teach the game to other people. He met Helen Derby, who was also an avid bridge player. And they would eventually marry and have a son named Richard. Helen's family was married into a well-known high society family. Her cousin Richard Derby was married to Ethel Roosevelt, which opened doors for J.B. J.B. would ultimately strike up a friendship and a partnership with Harold Sterling Vanderbilt, and they became auction bridge partners. J.B. was so well versed in the game of bridge that he began tutoring very wealthy people. And he also wrote books on the subject of bridge and became well known in that respect. He also became very wealthy. At the age of 44, he owned property in not only New York, Manhattan, he also owned property in Palm Beach, Florida, as well as 20 racehorses, 5 cars, and a yacht. So the Elwells were very well off, ran in high society circles, but he was also well known for something else. Oh, J.B. J.B. was a womanizer. He had many lovers. And when Helen found out, instead of what normally would happen in the 1920s, 1916s, 1915s, staying in said marriage and hoping that the husband changed or turning a blind eye to it. She said, nay, nay. Helen took little Richard and filed for separation. I guess this pretty much allowed J.B. to do what he wanted. And in 1920, they filed for divorce. Now, I'm not sure which one filed, and I'm not sure exactly how it worked back then, if you had to file for separation first before a divorce, or if she was just hoping he would change. Either way, divorce was filed in 1920. I'm going to say it was probably the early 1920s because of what happened in the mid 1920s. So let's fast forward to June 10th, 1920. That evening, J.B. had a dinner date with a newly divorced love interest by the name of Viola Krause. They went to the Ritz-Carlton, had dinner, dancing, and then went on to a midnight frolic show afterwards. We know that J.B. arrived home at 2:30 in the morning because the taxi driver who took him home said this to the police, that's when he dropped him off at 2:30 in the morning of June 10th. June 11th. Police assume that he went inside, got a couple hours of sleep, and then at 6:09 in the morning, he's making some phone calls. I could not, in my in my investigation, my research, I could not find anything of who he called, what the phone calls were pertaining to. After that, though, he was seen at 7:09 in the morning getting his newspaper from the front porch. And that would be the last time anybody saw J.B. Elwell alive. Now, a little while later, Marie Larson, his Swedish housekeeper, arrives for her daily work. She lets herself in. She did have to unlock the front door. And she sees that the living room door is not only closed, but it's locked, which in her words, that door was never locked. The living room door was never locked. It was always unlocked or open. So she uses her key to enter the living room. And of course, she's a maid. She's going to have keys to all the rooms to get into because she has to clean said rooms. That is part of her job. So she is going to have access to those rooms by a key. She enters the living room and sees Mr. Elwell sitting in a chair, or who she assumes is Mr. Elwell sitting in a chair, and she greets him. Odd thing number two, he doesn't respond, which he always responds. He's a very jovial man. He's very outgoing, personable. He's not going to let a woman, especially his housekeeper, greet him and not say something in return. So she walks over to the chair and she's taken aback by what she sees because the man in the chair she doesn't recognize. The man in the chair is a gaunt looking man, balding, and no teeth. The newspaper sitting on his lap, and a bullet hole in his head. At first she doesn't recognize him. Now, this is his housekeeper who has seen him numerous times, probably daily, or most days, and she doesn't recognize him. But that's because he's not put together like he normally would be. This man is 44, so he's already balding. You wouldn't think that a 44-year-old man would look like an old man in a chair. Eventually, she does recognize him, though, because he does wear a wig, he does wear dentures, and apparently he's not as broad as he seems to be in his suits. She immediately goes to the police and they come and start their investigation. She does let them know that the room was locked, that she had to use a key to enter it. And looking at the windows are locked from the inside. There's another door that leads out to a side parlor or side area of the home, and that's also locked from the inside. So you've got a big whodunit here. Why is the door locked? Why was the door locked from the inside? How did they get in and how did they get out? Of course, you can assume maybe it was suicide. Why would a man who has everything going for him and who was just out on a dinner date the night before commit suicide? Well, they rule that out because they find a bullet, a .45 bullet, sitting on the table in front of him. They find a .45 spent shell casing on the floor. They don't find a gun. There's a .45 bullet hole in his head, but there's no gun. So a dead man's not going to get up and go take and put the gun away or hide a gun. So it can only be deduced that this was murder. Correct? Correct. So there's that. Now, they question Marie. She tells them everything was locked. This is the way she found the room. So they start searching the home. In the home, they find stacks of cash in the home. They find expensive jewelry in the home. They find a Rembrandt painting in the home. What they don't find is anything taken from the home. So we're gonna rule out robbery. Safe to say, if nothing's missing, robbery's not a motive. Now, I'm going to say that he was dropped off alone. Could somebody have came to visit him? Sure, but if they came to visit him, why was he not with his wig and teeth? I don't know. I couldn't find where he allowed people to see him like that, other than maybe the housekeeper who, if she didn't recognize him right away, probably wasn't used to seeing him without the wig and the teeth also. Another thing they found interesting and odd was that he was just sitting in the chair. There was no sign of a struggle. There was no sign of forced entry. There was no signs of him fighting for his life. That was another thing. And as an investigator, I'm sure they were trying to figure, how did somebody get in this room? How did somebody leave him like this? And the doors are all locked. Who could have actually done it? Further investigation, they did determine that he was shot in the head with a .45. And with the blood spatter, they did find that whoever did it was crouched in front of him. So he let somebody get that close to him and pull a gun and shoot him. So we know robbery wasn't a motive. And when they searched the residence, there was one thing that they found that they thought was going to blow the case wide open. J.B. kept a love list. And it was a list of the names and numbers of 50 women who he had affairs with or who he had some sort of a relationship with. And he made notes about them. And believe me, I looked to see if there was any information on those love list notes. I don't know if it was a rating list or if it was just notes on what they were like or what they liked or what. But I couldn't find anything that talked about what the notes were about the women. Now, I need to change colors, and I'm trying to see, do I go back with white? No, I think I want to go with this color. So now we're going to change colors on our crochet project. So here's this list of 50 women. And that is something that gains the interest of the police. And that gives them a list of 50 suspects, along with the housekeeper. Now, Miss Larson was a suspect as well because she had access to all the rooms in the house. She was questioned numerous times. And in that questioning, every time she was questioned, they looked at her every time, because every time they questioned her, she would give new information. But they did determine that she was just trying to protect not only her employer, but also his list of love interests, or however you want to call what they were. The majority of these women were married. So I'm sure that Marie, because she's an employee, and I'm sure she was probably paid fairly well, she was going to keep, as best as she could, the secrets of not only Mr. Elwell, but of his women friends as well. Again, the majority of those women were married. So that in itself just made their suspect list go way off the charts. The prime suspect, after the housekeeper was found to not have done it, was Helen, the soon-to-be ex Mrs. Elwell. Now let's think about this. Did she have motive? Well, yeah, she's divorcing him. He was a womanizer. She was in love with the man. If he dies before the divorce is final, she's the spouse. Now, I don't know about New York law, but I would think that she would be entitled to the estate. So, therefore, she would be a prime suspect. And being on a list, it makes you wonder, did she know about the list of women? And if she did, though, and she's on the list, why would she not get rid of the list? Anyway, that's a moot point because they found that she couldn't have done it. She had an alibi. Now, I don't know how well they checked out alibis in 1920, but, there's an alibi. She wasn't the only one on the list, though. The police had to question 49 other women. They were all found to have alibis. Unfortunately, for those 49 other women, they had husbands and fathers and brothers and maybe lovers, other lovers. And those people had to be questioned too. You would think that something would come out of over 100 suspects, if not more. But no, no, they were all pretty much cleared. The police kept investigating all the leads. Again, Marie Larson was questioned at least 3 times, and each time there were there was new information that she would give. They also interviewed the taxi driver, which was, in some instances they said he had a driver, but most of the time it was a taxi. So I think he mainly got the same taxi driver a lot of times. This taxi driver did come forward and say that he had given rides to 3 different women at 3 different times to Mr. Elwell's residence, to JB's residence. I'm assuming to spend the evening with him. None of those 3 women that he claimed to have given rides to were ever questioned because they were never found. And so there were 3 possible suspects who were never interviewed. Again, his reputation as a womanizer preceded him. So there was a lot of people that they say would have had a motive to be angry enough to kill him, especially the husbands of the women he had affairs with. But nothing came from it. He also it was also a big thing as to how he let somebody get so close to him to pull out a gun, and he didn't struggle. He didn't fight. They did look at fingerprints. The only fingerprints were his and his housekeeper's. I did in my research find that there were some of the women that he had affairs with had keys to his home. Again, they were all questioned and determined not to be the perpetrators. It was also found that he had friends that had keys to his home. Again, those people were questioned, and it was determined that they did not do it. And how those people, I don't know if they had alibis, I'm not sure, because in the stuff that I read, they just didn't suspect them of doing it. So the case stayed cold, and a few years later, there was a break in the case when a gentleman came forward and claimed to have been the killer. He claimed to have gone into the home and murdered J.B. Elwell. Police investigated this gentleman, and though they thought that it was a big break, it turned out to be a big dud. The man had mental issues, and it was determined that he did not even know J.B. Elwell. He did not know where he lived. He made it up. Nobody knows why, if it was just a 15 minutes of fame type thing, but he did. It was found that he was lying. He didn't murder him. Case went back to being cold, and it's hard to believe that somebody with as much wealth and as much notoriety as this man, that nobody was ever found to have committed the murder. And it was never determined how somebody entered the living room, murdered him and then locked the door behind them because not everybody had a key to the living room. I'm assuming that all the keys, there was a separate key for the main doors than to the inside doors. And of course, that was why Marie Larson was a suspect, because she had keys to the doors in the home, but she would because she was the housekeeper. She had to. She had to be able to get in and clean their house. So this man, who had been famous in life, became even more famous upon his death. F. Scott Fitzgerald, it is said that he based The Great Gatsby off of J.B. Elwell and how he lived his life. Which I can say probably, because if you've read The Great Gatsby or you've seen the movie made about it, multiple movies made about it, he was a jovial, outgoing, albeit odd individual. And he loved his wealth. And he was not afraid of hiding it. But you would think that if that was a motive to his murder, somebody would have took the cash that was in his home, or the jewels, or even the Rembrandt. But they didn't. Nobody was ever arrested for his murder. And nobody ever will be. That's the sad part about the old unsolved murders, is nobody ever will be. Stories of locked room murders were told before his murder and will continue to be told after. But let's start with some questions. Let's go to get to some questions that I have. So in investigating this, and maybe you guys have some insights into how this happened, okay, or why. So here's my main question. For somebody to get that close to this man, to be in his most vulnerable state of his wig's not on, his teeth isn't in, he's not looking like he normally would, he allowed somebody into his home, if that's how they entered. If he let them in or if they let themselves in. Why did he let them get so close with a gun? Why didn't he fight? Now, was it because it was a woman who entered the home, or who was already in the home, had let themselves in, and had went into the living room where he was sitting to read his paper? And maybe the woman confronted him, had a gun, but maybe he didn't think that she would actually do it. If it were a man, wouldn't he have been more apt to defend himself? Because if you have a man with a gun and a woman with a gun, more likely than not, the man is actually going to use the gun. That's what I would think anyway. Maybe he didn't think the woman would use the gun. Also, another idea is Maybe he fell asleep and was asleep when the person entered and then shot him. But then they would have to know where the key was to lock the living room door, if there was a spare key to lock the living room door. Now, that's another thing I never could find out in my research was, what was there an extra key in maybe the kitchen or wherever they kept extra keys in those times, spare keys that could have locked the door as they left and then put that key back. But you would think that if that's the case, the police would have dusted any sets of keys for fingerprints. Now, back in those days, maybe there was a skeleton key that was used. Who knows? There's so many questions. I just find it hard to believe that the police would not have been able to answer some of those, right? Again, my thought process is that it was a female. Now, a female would have access to their husband's guns, which would account for it being a 45. Back in the day, and the stuff I read and who the people I talked to who have experience with guns, is back in those days, women would more than likely carry a small Derringer or something a little bit smaller, not so much a 45, though 45s were the main guns at that time. But I'm still thinking that a woman, if she didn't want to be caught, she would maybe grab the husband's gun, and maybe she didn't like the fact that he went out on a date with Viola, that was his newest love interest, maybe a jealousy thing. Again, they would have to know that there was a key to lock that door. And who would know about keys to lock doors? Women. Because if you think about it, women are more than likely going to know where to put the keys, where they would be located, and I just don't think that men thought about those things back in the day. Now, I'm probably wrong, but I think more women would think about the whole key thing and where it would be located and to actually lock the door. And you got to wonder, were some of these people who were suspects, were they mystery readers who had read cases about murders of the locked behind locked doors, like the Sherlock Holmes case? Things that make you go, That's my big question. Those are my biggest questions. And which leads me down the road of it being a woman who did it, because of not just the key, but crouching in front of them. Women are known to be shorter than most men. So it wouldn't take too much for it to be, instead of a man, like somebody squatting in front of them, at the height of a woman, she wouldn't really have to squat. It would just be where she aimed. Hmm. So instead of a man having to squat in front of him, the woman would just be standing in front of him. And, you look at it and you think, if it was a woman, had she ever seen him without his wig and his dentures and not being this, you know, person who they felt to be bigger than they actually were. That just makes it all, makes you wonder, did the police think about these questions or follow these leads, which I'm sure they were, but I don't know. In the days since things have been, um, as times have changed, maybe more things, more questions come out because of the times change. It's been over 100 years since this happened. So, you know, if it was a woman who used a 45, 45s have a kick. And if you're have any familiarity with shooting guns, which I do, um, a 45 has a bigger kick. So unless a woman has knowledge of this and has shot one before, it makes you wonder if the person had knowledge of how a 45 recoil would be. And why would a woman choose a 45 unless that's what she could get her hands on? Again, a husband's gun, a father's gun, a brother's gun. It's just, that's a question that I'm wondering if they looked into all that. I'm sure they would have, but it just makes you wonder how they never could come across. Now, I know they didn't have ballistics testing back then that I'm aware of, other than to see what gauge of a bullet it was. If it was a 22, a 45, a 40, whatever, 38, whatever. I don't think they didn't have the testing back then that they could know for sure which gun the bullet would have come from, because they had the spent casing, but they didn't have um, the murder weapon. And did they dust the bullets, the bullet and the bullet casing, for fingerprints? Because that's something they do now, but was that something they did then? It's hard to find out a lot about how they investigated cases back then, uh, because there's not a lot of information out there on it. We know robbery wasn't a motive, because why wouldn't they have taken anything? Scorned lover? The husband? A husband of one of the lovers? Father? Brother? Other lover? Or was it somebody else in the bridge community that maybe wanted a piece of the action, but they couldn't get it unless he was out of the way? That could be too. But I'm thinking more and more along the lines of it being a female, because why didn't he fight? Why didn't he try to save his own life? And I think, in my opinion, it's because if it was a woman standing there, a scorned lover, somebody who fell in love with him, but he wasn't in love with her because he was still sowing his wild oats everywhere, maybe he just didn't think she'd do it. Hmm. I think she did. My bet's on one of the 50 women that were on that list, or one of the 3 women that they never found. Because maybe he was messing around with one of those three women who decided that they were in love, and if they couldn't have him, nobody else could have him either. So the case of the locked room murder in 1920 still remains a mystery today in 2026. And I'm sure that they had their suspicions. Just like all the other cold cases from those time periods, I'm sure the police had their suspicions. They just couldn't prove it. And there we are with a case that will never be solved. And even if it is, nobody will ever be brought to justice because they're not alive. But J.B. Elwell infamously remains famous today. And not just for his bridge knowledge and his books, but because he was a womanizer who had a harem of different women, and somebody decided that enough was enough and took his life. And whoever did it got away with murder. Thanks for watching episode 4. And if you like what you see, subscribe. Hit that subscribe button. Every week I'll have a new episode. Tell your friends. Tell your family. Let's get a bunch of subscriptions, and I'll bring you more cases in the future. Thank you. Enjoy your coffee. Enjoy your crochet projects. And I'll see you next time on Coffee, Crochet, and Unsolved Murder.